Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where we uncover the untold and haunting stories of America's past. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story from history's shadows. Now, let's travel back to 1822 Charleston, South Carolina, and uncover the chilling tale of 1822 Charleston Horror, the slave who turned sleep into death for 40 overseers out in the sultry, choking heat of Charleston, South Carolina, in the year 1822. The air was thick not only with the weight of summer, but with the tension of lives shackled and spirits bowed. The city itself hummed with commerce, the docks lined with ships carrying goods of every kind. But behind the stately brick facades and the bustling wharves, a darkness festered, a darkness born of cruelty, fear, and unrelenting oppression. In this world of stark contrasts, where wealth and decay walked hand in hand, the lives of those who were enslaved were written in shadows, their suffering often hidden beneath the polished veneer of Southern society. Among these shadows lived a house slave named Amara. Her world was one of constant vigilance and quiet suffering. Every day she walked the polished floors of grand Charleston mansions, serving men and women who looked upon her not as a human being, but as property, a tool for their comfort. Her hands, small and delicate, bore the invisible scars of decades of enforced servitude. Her eyes, dark and wary, had seen the cruelty that the city's elites considered normal. Men beaten for the smallest misstep, women punished for daring to speak, and families torn apart as if the heart itself was an expendable commodity. But in Amara, beneath the layers of forced obedience, simmered a fire that no whip could quell, a fire fueled by grief, rage, and a yearning for justice that the law would never grant her. The story of that summer began quietly, in whispers and glances. Amara had long observed the cruel routine of the overseers, the men who patrolled the plantations, the sleeping quarters, and even the kitchens, ensuring that no slave dared to claim a moment of dignity or defiance. 40 overseers, a number that would come to haunt the city, were stationed across Charleston and the surrounding plantations. They were men hardened by greed and entitlement, men whose nights were as cruel as their days, while the enslaved labored under the relentless sun. These overseers slept in lavish rooms, unaware that a reckoning was quietly taking shape under their noses. Amara's mind was sharp, her instincts honed by years of surviving both subtle and brutal attacks on her humanity. She observed patterns, the rounds of the overseers, the times when doors were left unlatched, the ways servants moved about the mansions unnoticed. Each observation, each small piece of information, was stored carefully, like a treasure, in her mind. It was not simply anger that drove her, but a precise understanding that opportunity could be cultivated even under the tightest chains. She had no illusions. The cost of defiance would be death, but even death, she knew, was preferable to a life without justice, a life under the suffocating hand of the enslaver. The city itself was a maze of contradictions. On one hand, Charleston was proud of its culture, its architecture, its trade. On the other, it thrived on a system built upon the suffering of those who toiled silently. In this oppressive environment, Amara was not alone in her suffering, but she carried a rare audacity within her. While the other enslaved around her whispered among themselves about escape, about secret rebellions, Amara planned with the cold patience of a strategist. She knew the city like a second skin, knew which houses had flammable materials stored carelessly, knew the kitchens and the stacks of oil and tallow that could turn a single spark into an inferno. Her plan did not grow overnight. It was nurtured in the quiet moments of her servitude. As she polished the brass fittings of a chandelier in one mansion, she imagined the consequences of a fire, the chaos it would sow, and the justice it might deliver. She watched the overseers with meticulous attention, noting who snored heavily, who left their keys on the table, who treated the enslaved with a cruel amusement. Each observation fed into a larger, terrifying design one that would shake Charleston to its very foundations. Evenings in the city carried the scent of salt water. From the harbor, mingled with the smoke of cooking fires and the faint, haunting odors of disease and decay. In these evenings, Amara moved quietly through the streets, gathering small items, taking note of who was on guard and when, always careful to appear as the obedient house slave she was expected to be. Her outward compliance was her mask, her survival tool. But beneath it, her mind worked tirelessly, calculating, imagining, and preparing for a night that would become legend. A night when the hands that had been bound too long would finally strike back. This first part of Amara's story is not merely one of vengeance, but of survival and cunning in a world that sought to crush both. It is a story of courage born in the most desperate circumstances, of a woman who understood that inaction was a slow death, and that the smallest opportunity could ignite a chain of events that would echo far beyond her own life. In the quiet of Charleston streets, beneath the glimmer of lantern light, a plan began to take shape, a plan that would turn sleep into terror, that would force the city to confront the consequences of its cruelty, and that would mark the year 1822 with a horror that could never be forgotten. The nights grew longer and heavier with the coming of summer, the Charleston heat pressing down on the cobblestone streets and the grand porches alike. By the time the fateful night arrived, Amara had learned every rhythm, every nuance of the lives of those 40 overseers. She had memorized the patterns of their steps, the creak of the doors they left unlocked, the faint sighs of exhaustion that slipped from their lips as they sank into beds they thought secure. For months she had walked among them unnoticed, a shadow with the face of obedience, while her mind spun a web of precise, dreadful design. She waited for the night when the city would be stillest, when the summer winds carried away the last of the laughter from Charleston's taverns, and the scent of baked bread from the kitchens faded into the humid air. On that night, the smoke of burning tallow and oil would not seem unusual. A flickering candle, left carelessly, could explain almost anything. She moved through the mansions with the quiet grace of someone invisible, a servant performing the rituals of routine, all while laying the seeds of destruction that had been months in planning. The first steps were simple in appearance, but deadly. In consequence, she gathered oil from kitchens, flammable rags from storage rooms, and straw from hidden corners. Each item seemed mundane, ordinary, part of the endless tasks expected of her. Yet in her hands, they became instruments of terror, each piece meticulously positioned to create a chain reaction that would not be stopped once it began. Amara worked in silence, her heartbeat steady, her breathing controlled, as though the calm itself were part of the spell she was weaving. Every creak of a floorboard, every distant bark from a city dog was noted but ignored. The world had grown quiet around her in recognition of the violence she was about to unleash, as if it too waited in breathless anticipation. When the overseers finally retired for the night, they did so unaware of the danger lying in their midst. 40 men, cruel and entitled, sank into their beds, confident that the walls of their homes and the presence of countless servants ensured their safety. Amara, invisible in her carefully rehearsed routine, moved through the shadows, igniting each carefully placed spark, a momentary flicker that would bloom into an unstoppable blaze. One by one, the houses erupted into flames, the fire leaping hungrily across wood and straw, consuming everything in its path. Panic erupted in the city. The first screams came from those who had been closest to the initial ignitions, and then chaos spread like wildfire. Overseers stumbled from their rooms, half awake and half comprehending the horror around them. The fire consumed the stairways, the hallways, the very air, turning Charleston's summer night into a living nightmare. Those who tried to flee found doors jammed, windows blocked, and floors collapsing beneath them. The smoke choked, burned, and blinded, a suffocating reminder that even the mighty could fall. Amara moved silently among the chaos, ensuring that her plan unfolded with precision. She did not linger to watch the deaths of those who had made her life a torment, because for her, this was not about vengeance in the narrow, human sense. It was about justice. Every scream, every frantic cry, every futile attempt to escape was proof that the city's cruelty had finally met with consequences it could not control. Yet even in the midst of destruction, her mind remained sharp, calculating the next steps, ensuring that the fire spread, that no escape routes were overlooked, that the chaos was absolute. By dawn, the city was trembling. The smoke lingered in. The streets and the stench of burnt timber and flesh hung heavy in the air. Charlestonians awoke to a horror that seemed unimaginable. 40 overseers, men whose lives had been deemed untouchable, had perished in a single night. Houses that had been symbols of wealth and power were reduced to smoldering ruins, the grandeur of the city mocked by the unrelenting flames. In the aftermath, whispers spread through the enslaved communities. A name, a shadow, a story of a woman who had dared to strike back at a system that had crushed so many. The news traveled fast, carried on the wind like a warning. The elite of Charleston were horrified, not merely by the loss of property and lives, but by the reminder that the enslaved were not silent, unthinking beings. They were capable of cunning, of planning, of exacting justice in ways that could not be anticipated or contained. Amara's act was more than destruction. It was a message, one that reverberated through the streets, plantations, and homes. Oppression had limits, and the spirit of those who had been bound could not be broken. Entirely. Charleston was paralyzed in the days that followed. Investigations were launched, guards doubled, and the city's elite whispered of rebellion, of sabotage, and of the impossible of a house slave who had turned sleep into death for 40 overseers. No one could quite believe that such an act could occur, and yet the evidence, the scorched ruins and the charred remains, was undeniable. Fear gripped the city, fear of those whose lives were controlled, yet whose minds were free, and who, when pushed beyond endurance, could orchestrate consequences that even wealth and power could not prevent. Amara herself vanished into the labyrinth of Charleston streets and the surrounding countryside. Her identity became a shadow, a legend whispered among the enslaved, a symbol of daring and cunning. The city could punish no one for the disaster, for the plan had been flawless, and her existence became intertwined with the terror that had consumed Charleston. Families of overseers wept. The elite pondered the meaning of control and the limits of fear. And in the enslaved quarters, a cautious sense of hope stirred a realization that even under the cruelest oppression, courage could manifest in the most unexpected and devastating ways. This night marked a turning point. For the enslaved, it was proof that the fires of justice could rise, that intelligence, courage, and patience could overturn the structures of power, if only for a fleeting moment. For the city, it was a wound that would not heal, a scar on the collective consciousness, a horror remembered in every whispered story and every fearful glance. And for Amara, it was the culmination of years of suffering, a meticulous orchestration that transformed her anguish into an act that would echo through the centuries as both a tragedy and a grimly heroic act of resistance. The morning sun rose over Charleston, but its light did little to dispel the darkness that had settled across the city. Smoke still curled from the ruins of the burned homes, a stubborn reminder of the night's horrors. The streets were littered with charred debris, shattered furniture, and remnants of what had once been symbols of wealth and authority. The air carried a bitter, acrid taste, and a silence had fallen over the city that was deeper and heavier than any natural stillness. It was a silence born of shock, of fear, and of the realization that the unthinkable had occurred. 40 overseers, men who had once walked the city with arrogance and cruelty, were gone. Their absence left a void that wealth and influence could not fill, and the people of Charleston were left grappling with the impossible question: how had it happened? Panic rippled through the elite neighborhoods. Families barricaded themselves in their homes, fearful of a threat they could not see. Servants moved nervously in the streets, aware that the city's authorities would scrutinize them. Yet many whispered among themselves about the mysterious figure who had orchestrated such devastation. Rumors spread faster than the fire itself. Some claimed it was a revolt, organized by dozens of enslaved people. Others whispered of a single cunning woman who had outwitted the entire city. Amid the chaos, there was fear, but there was also awe-reluctant admiration for a mind capable of planning and executing such an act of precision and terror that authorities arrived in force, surveying the destruction with a mixture of disbelief and fury. Men in fine clothes shouted orders, searching for culprits and attempting to make sense of the scale of the devastation. They questioned servants, neighbors, and anyone who might provide a clue, but the trail ran cold. There were no signs of a large-scale uprising, no evidence of multiple conspirators, only the carefully orchestrated chaos that spoke to a single mind at work. In the city's elite circles, the name of Amara, or at least the story of a shadowy, calculating figure spread quickly, though no one could confirm her identity. She became a ghost in the imagination of Charleston, a specter who had dared to strike at the heart of their power. Among the enslaved population, the story was different. Amara's act became a symbol, a tale of courage and defiance passed quietly, from one person to another. Mothers whispered it to children at night, warning them of the dangers of cruelty, but also instilling a sense of pride in the capacity for resistance. Fathers shared it with sons and daughters in hushed tones, emphasizing the importance of intelligence, patience, and bravery. Amara, though physically unseen, existed vividly in their minds, a figure who had taken the despair of bondage and transformed it into an act of formidable agency. In the hearts of those who lived under constant oppression, she became a legend, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, resistance was possible. Meanwhile, Charleston's elite struggled to reclaim a sense of order. Investigations dragged on, driven more by desperation and fear than by a genuine hope of uncovering the truth. They examined the burned houses, the remains of the overseers, and the materials used to start the fires, trying to reconstruct events that seemed almost supernatural in their precision. Each discovery of flammable oil, hidden rags, or strategically placed straw deepened their anxiety. How could one person have orchestrated such devastation? How could a single enslaved woman, expected to obey and submit, move with such cunning and foresight? The very notion shook them to the core, forcing them to confront a reality they had long ignored, that intelligence, courage, and determination were not the exclusive domain of the free and powerful Dot. As days passed, the city's fear evolved into obsession. Guards patrolled streets more rigorously, night watches doubled their numbers, and owners scrutinized their servants with suspicion. Yet Amara remained a ghost, never caught, never seen. Every attempt to locate her failed, and with each failure, the legend grew. The fire had done more than destroy property and take lives. It had disrupted the illusion of control that Charleston's elite relied upon. Their wealth and authority could not shield them from consequences, and the psychological impact was profound. Families who had once slept peacefully in their mansions now approached each night with anxiety, fearful that fire or sabotage might strike again. For the enslaved, however, life continued under the same oppressive rules, yet with a subtle shift. In consciousness, Amara's act became a silent form of empowerment. Servants moved with greater caution, but also with a heightened sense of awareness that their minds were not imprisoned, even if their bodies were. They began to understand that patience, intelligence, and opportunity could yield results beyond brute force. Amara's defiance was a lesson in strategy, in courage, and in the power of subtle rebellion. It became a tale told around hushed fires, a story that carried hope alongside fear, and a narrative that reminded them that even in the worst circumstances, there were ways to claim agency. The aftermath also revealed the city's fragility. Charlestonians realized that their society, built meticulously on rigid hierarchies and the oppression of the enslaved, could be shattered in an instant. One person, one act, could disrupt the carefully maintained illusion of control. The fire was a scar on Charleston's memory, a wound that would shape conversations, decisions, and fears for years to come. Even those who had escaped the fire physically carried its psychological impact. Every shadow, every flicker of flame, and every creak in the floor reminded them that the city's foundations were not as secure as they had believed. Amara's story, though incomplete in the eyes of history, endured through oral tradition. Among the enslaved, she was remembered as a strategist, a thinker, a force capable of turning despair into action. Among the elite, she was remembered as a nightmare, a warning, a ghost that had exposed the vulnerability hidden beneath their wealth. The duality of her legacy reflected the complexity of her act, destruction intertwined with empowerment, fear interwoven with inspiration. It was a story that could not be easily categorized, a story that demanded contemplation and acknowledgement of both human cruelty and human courage. And while the city scrambled to recover, Amara had already vanished into the labyrinthine streets, the marshlands, and the hidden corners of Charleston. She became part of the city's shadow, an unseen presence whose story grew with each retelling. No one knew where she had gone, but her impact remained, etched into the charred ruins, whispered in frightened halls, and celebrated in quiet quarters. The fires had claimed lives, but they had also ignited a new consciousness, one that would not be extinguished easily. Amara, through careful planning and unparalleled courage, had transformed a night of terror into a legacy of resistance that would echo far beyond the limits of Charleston streets. The weeks and months that followed the Charleston fire of 1822 were a time of unease, reflection, and quiet reckoning. The city struggled to rebuild the charred mansions, repair the broken streets, and restore the fragile sense of order that had been shattered in a single night-long blaze. But no amount of reconstruction could restore the peace of mind that had been lost. The memory of that night lingered like a shadow over Charleston, in the whispers of servants, the nervous glances of elite families, and the stories told in hushed tones along the docks and in back alleys. 40 overseers had perished, and the city had been forced to confront a reality it had long refused to acknowledge. The enslaved were not merely tools or property, but human beings with intelligence, agency, and the capacity for resistance. Amara, though never seen again, became more than a woman. She became a symbol. Among the enslaved population, her legend grew with each retelling. She was described as a figure of courage and cunning, a mind that had transformed despair into decisive action. Mothers recounted her story to children at night, teaching lessons of vigilance and strategy, as well as the importance of hope even in the harshest conditions. Fathers spoke of her quietly to sons and daughters, emphasizing the power of intellect and patience. In a world designed to crush the spirit, Amara's act became a rare proof that even the smallest, most oppressed could wield power in ways the oppressors could not anticipate. Charleston's elite, meanwhile, remained haunted by the fire. It was not simply the destruction of property or the loss of life that tormented them, but the shattering of an illusion that control was absolute, that cruelty could be exercised without consequence. Even as buildings were rebuilt, the fear lingered, embedded in the architecture of the city and the psyche of its inhabitants. Guards were posted in greater numbers. Overseers scrutinized their servants more closely, and the threat of rebellion was spoken of in hushed tones. But the very measures meant to assert control revealed the anxiety beneath. A city grappling with the knowledge that one mind, driven by suffering and intelligence, could alter the course of its history. The fire also left a moral and emotional scar, not easily erased. Families of the overseers mourned their lost kin, while the enslaved lived with a complex mix of fear, pride, and cautious exhilaration. Amara's act had been violent, yes, but it had been precise, deliberate, and carefully calculated. It was an act of justice as much as vengeance, a statement that cruelty was not without consequence. The enslaved who heard the story felt both awe and empowerment, knowing that even under the tightest chains, courage and intellect could carve a path to action. The city may have rebuilt its houses, but the memory of the fire and of the woman who had orchestrated it remained indelible. Historians and chroniclers of the time struggled to explain the events. Many could not comprehend that a single enslaved woman could wield such foresight and skill. Official records were sparse, intentionally obscured, or tinged with fear. Yet the oral traditions preserved what the written histories omitted. Stories circulated about Amara's movements, her careful planning, and the calm precision with which she executed a plan that would haunt the city forever. Her name, though whispered cautiously by some, became synonymous with defiance, courage, and strategic brilliance, a reminder that heroism can emerge in the unlikeliest of places. And from the most oppressed of lives, in the years that followed, the legend of Amara transformed from a story of horror into a story of enduring resistance. While the elite tried to suppress memory and control narrative, the enslaved preserved it, passing the tale along with reverence and care. They told it not only as a cautionary tale of consequences for cruelty, but also as inspiration, a reminder that the human spirit, even under the harshest oppression, can find ways to assert itself. Amara became a symbol of intellect meeting courage, of patience meeting resolve, and of despair transformed into deliberate, unstoppable action. Charleston itself could never return to its previous sense of security. Every summer night, the wind carried whispers of the fire. Every shadow in a hallway reminded residents of vulnerability, and the memory of 40 overseers dying while they slept was etched into the city's consciousness. The fire had destroyed more than buildings and lives. It had destroyed the arrogance of invulnerability, leaving a city forever aware that oppression can never fully suppress human agency. In this, Amara's legacy endured, a haunting testament to the power of one determined mind against the machinery of cruelty. Amara's final fate remained a mystery. Some said she escaped to the countryside, finding refuge among sympathetic communities or hidden networks of the enslaved. Others whispered she had vanished entirely, becoming a specter of vengeance that no one could catch or name. Her legend, however, did not depend on her survival. It depended on the indelible mark she left on Charleston, the proof that even the most constrained could orchestrate consequences that shook the foundations of power. Her story reminded every observer, whether oppressed or oppressor, that courage, intelligence, and determination could transcend chains, ignite change, and rewrite the narrative of oppression itself. By the time decades had passed, the tale of the Charleston fire had become part of the city's whispered history. Generations of the enslaved recounted it with reverence, teaching lessons of strategy, courage, and the moral complexity of resistance. Charleston's elite continued to live with the memory, wary of complacency, and forever marked by the fear of what could happen when the oppressed found both resolve and opportunity. And in every telling, Amara's shadow remained vivid, a woman who turned despair into power, suffering into strategy, and sleep into a reckoning that would haunt Charleston forever. Her act was horror. Yes, but it was also courage. It was tragedy. But it was justice. And it became legend. In the quiet corners of history, where the voices of the oppressed often go unheard, Amara's story stood tall, a reminder that even in the darkest night, a single spark, careful, deliberate, and unyielding, could change everything.